Hey guys, it's Justin here. A few weeks ago, I actually had the pleasure of sitting down with Hannah and Hasan from SoloSuit to discuss important questions surrounding debt collection lawsuits, and I'm happy to share that conversation with you, so let's jump right into it. Okay, so I'd love to get some questions answered on the lawsuit response and ultimately just like navigating legal stuff. So my first question is, what actually happens when you're sued in a debt lawsuit? What happens?
That's a great question. That's usually one of the questions that we get asked in like every one of our webinars and all the phone calls that we have with consumers. And typically what happens is consumer who is sued by a law firm gets served two documents, a summons and a complaint. The summons says, hey, you have to show up to court on this date. And the complaint specifies pretty much all the data that says, hey, consumer, you owe this amount of debt to this bank or to this debt buyer. And typically what happens is a consumer has a set number of days, depending on the state, to respond to the lawsuit. If they don't respond to the lawsuit, they get something called a default judgment, which means they would be liable for paying the full cost of the debt over a set period of time. And it may result in things like garnishment. So people's wages could be garnished, and that's basically money being taken out directly from their check. So their remediation. So what people can do is, for example, file a debt answer, which says, hey, like I don't acknowledge this debt. I don't know if this is me. I wasn't served properly, or I was served properly, and pretty much kick off the process of communicating with the collector to make sure that they get a settlement on the debt. And that way they can either structure a payment plan or make sure that they don't have to pay the full lawsuit amount, and they can save, maybe pay 70%, 60% on it as a lump sum. So that's typically how the process works. And kind of passing on to you if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I would also just add that most debt lawsuits in the United States end in a default judgment because most people don't know how to navigate the legal system. And so oftentimes they'll just like ignore the lawsuit, or maybe they don't realize that they have to respond before a deadline. And so when they do, they end up losing the case, and then their wages get garnished, or their bank accounts get frozen, or other really big consequences happen, right? So like Hasan said, if you can just file your answer before the deadline, that will help you initiate the process of finding a resolution. Even if it doesn't mean that you win the case ultimately, it'll at least get you on the right path to communicate with the collector, the debt buyer, or the bank that is suing you, and get on the path to finding like a resolution and agreement that will work for everyone involved.
Super, super helpful. I guess, and you kind of touched on this already, but are you guys able to provide maybe like a step-by-step of like how to actually respond to a summons?
Yeah, so when you've been sued by a debt collector or a bank, or you're just being sued for debt in general, the number one thing that you have to do is respond. So to respond, you're going to have to draft a written response. Your court may have a form that you can use to fill out. But in your response, you're going to need to respond to each of the claims that are listed against you in the complaint document. So when you got sued, you should have received this complaint document, and it's going to list the different claims that are against you, how much you owe, who you owe. It'll say things like where you live. It'll probably lay out a few other details about the debt. And it's your responsibility in your written answer to address each of the claims and either admit them, deny them, or say, I don't know if this is true or not. Most attorneys would say that it's best to admit, or it's best to deny as many claims as possible, because this will push the company or bank or debt collector that's suing you to prove that the claim is true. And if they don't have proof, then it might be tricky for them to win the lawsuit. So in most cases, it might be in your best interest to deny as many claims as you can, or at least say that you don't know. And then that'll help you maybe have some leverage in the case to then, contact the attorney that's suing you and try to negotiate with them and try to resolve the debt outside of the court system. But yeah, for step-by-step process, number one, you need to respond before your deadline, which is usually going to be 30 days or less, depending on where you live. Make sure that you file your written answer with the court and send a copy of it to the opposing attorney that's suing you. And then after you've filed your answer, you can decide, you'll have bought yourself time to decide what your next steps are going to be. Are you going to take the case to court and fight all the way through because maybe it's a fraudulent debt? Or maybe you know that you owe the debt. Then in that case, you might want to contact the attorney and figure out what your options are. Try to come up with some sort of a settlement outside of the court system that will help you avoid court costs, fees, and interest that would end up making you pay way more than they're suing you for. So that's a little bit of a step-by-step process.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, the next thing I wanted to get some clarity on is whether you can actually settle a debt after being sued. Is that something you can do?
The answer is yes, you definitely can. There might be limitations. For example, once the case reaches a lawsuit state, that typically means that the bank who hires that law firm has to pay them. So that means that your settlement options might be slightly limited. So if, let's say, before it reaches the lawsuit phase, you could have been able to settle maybe around 50% or something, depending on the debt, but now you may have to settle at 70%. So these are just, again, this depends on the type of debt, the age of debt. It also depends on the specific bank or the debt buyer. It also depends on things like, are you offering a payment plan or are you offering a lump sum? Lump sums are typically preferred since people just can get it over with. So again, all that really depends. We can also, for example, say, look, I don't know if I can pay all of this debt right away, but I'm willing to do a payment plan on this whole thing over X number of years. And that is a very, very common thing that happens as well.
And just a quick follow-up question to that, super helpful. If you do a lump sum, are you able to get back to that 50% settlement, or are you still looking at 70, 75 cents on the dollar, even with lump sum?
Yeah, we've seen in our data, it depends. So typically, just based on our internal data, debt buyers do have lower thresholds, but banks typically have higher ones. So that's I would say that's one way we can think about it. It also depends on things like, again, the age of debt. The older it is, chances are it'll probably be lower thresholds too. So
that's great. Thank you. So I guess one question then comes from that is does it make sense to fight a lawsuit, or does it make more sense to try to just settle?
I think that it also depends. If you have been sued and the debt is not valid, like let's say someone stole your identity and now they're coming after you saying you owe the debt, definitely fight that one. Like, gather your documentation to prove that you don't actually owe the debt and submit it with the courts and fight that lawsuit to the end, because you should not be held responsible for a debt that you don't actually owe. However, on the other hand, if you know that you owe the debt and the debt is valid, then it would be a good idea to maybe consider settling or looking into your settlement options. For sure, you definitely want to file an answer to the lawsuit to start engaging in that legal process, but that doesn't mean that you have to go to court and drag it out through the whole legal process. You can actually call the attorney and try to settle outside of court, and that would save you and them a lot of time, a lot of money, and probably a lot of emotional stress. So if you do owe the debt and you know that it's valid, then consider settling. That could actually be maybe the best outcome. But lastly, if you know that the debt is valid, but maybe it's past the statute of limitations, which is the the deadline that a collector or bank has to sue someone for the debt that they owe. If you know that the debt is super old and past the statute of limitations in your state, then it might be a good idea to try to fight the lawsuit to the end.
Great. That's super, super helpful. Okay, so I'd love to get some of these myths busted. One common myth I've seen is if I just ignore a lawsuit, it'll go away.
That is not true. If you ignore a lawsuit, it's going to come back to bite you in the butt in the future. The number one thing that you want to do is engage, respond, and be proactive, and try to come up with a solution. So if you ignore a lawsuit, here are some of the consequences that could happen. After a certain amount of time, usually somewhere between 14 to 30 days, if you ignore the lawsuit, then the person suing you can actually file what's called a motion for default judgment. And if the court grants that motion, then that means there's a default judgment in your case. And with a default judgment, debt collectors and banks can actually garnish your wages, which means they can take up to 25% of your monthly income. And that'll just come directly out of your paycheck. They'll contact your employer and they'll just take your money directly from your paycheck. So you'll notice hey, I'm getting hundreds of dollars less than I usually do. Well, that's what happens if you ignore a lawsuit. So that's why it's important to respond. Another consequence you may see if you ignore a lawsuit is your bank account could be frozen. And in some situations, debt collectors can actually literally take money directly from your bank account, depending on how much is there. And there are certain laws that they have to abide by as far as the amount that they can take out goes. But yeah, you might just see that your bank account gets drained one day, and that is something that that debt collectors legally can do in some situations. So that's another consequence if you ignore a debt lawsuit. And then lastly, in my opinion, the most scary consequence that could happen if you ignore a lawsuit is you may end up having to pay way more than you were originally sued for. So if you ignore it and you don't try to find a solution before, it drags on too long, then you could end up having to pay the debt that you owed, plus court costs, plus attorney fees, plus post-judgment interest. You could literally be paying thousands and thousands more, and that interest will continue to multiply as time goes by. So, ignoring a lawsuit is not going to make your debt go away. Having a conversation and being proactive and trying to communicate clearly with the person that's suing you or the debt collector or bank involved, that's what's going to help you make it go away and get on the right path to finding a resolution.
Okay, the next myth is you have to hire an expensive lawyer to deal with debt.
No, you don't. So it is very common for individuals who are in debt collections to represent themselves and go to court and just use the plethora of tools that are available online. So Ascend has lots of great resources that people can check out. Here at Solo, we have lots of articles, webinars on how to deal with these cases as well. We also offer a debt answer product that you can use to make responding to your lawsuit super easy. So there's so many resources available. The most important thing is that people do their research and they communicate. Other than that, these cases, they're kind of figured out in a way, right? There's nothing too complex about it if you really know the process and understand what you're doing. And again, just check out the bunch of resources that's available already. Just be aware of a bunch of the TikToks that tell you not to pay the debts. That is false. You please just look into reputable sources only.
Okay, I just want to jump in real quick again. Thanks for sticking around with this video so far. One thing you may want to look into if you're kind of comparing your options is taking our free debt calculator. It's linked below. It's going to help you understand the cost of all these options we're chatting about: bankruptcy, debt settlement, debt management, you name it. It's free to use. There's no credit impact. You don't even have to add personal information to use it unless you actually want to chat with us. Then we'll ask for your phone number. But my point is, it's free to use. It's quick. It'll help you compare your options, pros and cons, cost, everything you need. Take it in the description below. All right, back to the video.
Okay, what are 5 things you can do if you're served with a debt lawsuit?
Okay, I got this one. Number 1, you should research the debt. Do some research, figure out if it's actually valid, figure out if you actually owe it, figure out how old the debt was and the last time you made a payment on it. Because if it's been several years since you've even engaged with this debt, then there's a chance that you might not actually have to there's a chance that the company suing you might not have legal grounds to actually sue you for it if it's past the statute of limitations in your state. Number 2, once you've understood the debt a little bit better, be sure to file an answer into the lawsuit. So you can actually use SoloSuit to draft and file a personalized, customized answer to your case, and then we actually can help you file it with the courts. But yeah, that would actually be step number 3. Make sure to, once you've responded to the lawsuit, file the documents with the court and send a copy to the opposing attorney. This will ensure that you've got your answer in before the deadline and you'll avoid consequences like default judgment. And it'll open up more options for you to find a resolution if you do owe the debt and it is within the statute of limitations. Step number 4 would be definitely check for your case status updates. If you don't know what's happening with your case, you can call the court clerk where you live, ask them if there's a trial or a hearing scheduled, and if there is, be sure to attend. You definitely always want to show up, because if you don't show up, it could end up meaning that you lose the case. So number 4, watch for hearings, watch for trials that might be scheduled, and just in general, make sure that you stay updated with your case. And then lastly, number 5, once you've filed an answer to your lawsuit, you might consider looking into other options to try to resolve the debt. So you might consider trying to negotiate and settle the debt outside of the court process, and just having a private conversation with the attorney that's suing you to see what your options are to pay off the debt or to get on a payment plan to try to resolve it and just get back on track. So yeah, that would be the 5 steps I would recommend.
Love it. Okay, so what are 3 common mistakes people are making when they try to settle debt?
Yes, great question. So the first mistake, and this is the biggest one, is not communicating or waiting too long. You cannot expect to have a good settlement, if you're not talking to the people that are responsible for collecting your debt. So please always try to stay in touch. The people tend to be very, very helpful, and they genuinely want to work with you. Mistake number 2 is we often see people say they call a debt collector and they ask for settlement options, but they don't really have an understanding of how much they can afford or what hardships they even have to qualify for a settlement. So what you want to do is you want to come up with a good evidence as to why you were not able to pay the debt, whether that's medical hardship, for example, or your loved one was hurt and you're taking care of a loved one. And also look into your bank statements and understand how much you can afford monthly, and actually talk to the debt collector and say, this is how much I can do. Those conversations tend to be a lot more fruitful. Final mistake is sometimes I think when people, for example, visit some other sources online and people tell them offer a very, very low amount, that's exactly what you don't want to do, because that communicates to the debt collector that you are not serious about trying to settle your debt. And so they would want to communicate even less with you. So what you want to do instead is try to really understand how much you can afford and genuinely offer that amount. If it's not 100%, that's totally fine, but try to give something that's maybe like slightly over 50% that is reasonable. And we've seen a lot of success with consumers being happy and being able to resolve their debt if offered slightly above that amount.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. How do you actually deal with aggressive debt collector tactics?
Okay, so this is interesting because there are a lot of laws that exist out there that protect people from aggressive debt collection tactics. The number one being the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the FDCPA, which is a federal law that outlines specific behavior that debt collectors cannot exhibit. So I will say though, most debt collection agencies are specifically trained to follow the FDCPA. So in general, debt collectors are trying to be compliant with federal laws, and they're trying to not break the law and not be too aggressive when they're collecting a debt. That doesn't mean that all collectors follow it perfectly. Debt collectors are also incentivized by a payment structure that incentivizes them to be a little bit more I don't want to say aggressive, but like really push to get a debt collected. So there's this really fine line between being aggressive and like breaking the law and still being compliant, but also like really pushing to get someone to pay. So if someone has taken it too far, you should definitely educate yourself on your rights under the FDCPA. And we have like a really great blog on SoloSuit.com that outlines all of the violations that might happen when a debt collector is trying to collect. And it specifically breaks down the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act to explain like which behaviors are legal and which ones are not. So for example, like debt collectors cannot call you before 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m. in your local time. They can only call you like a certain amount of times each day and each week. They can't harass you, they can't threaten you, they can't call you names or use any sort of crude or intimidating language when they talk to you. And they also have to reveal who they are. So if they're trying to collect a debt from you, they have to say, I'm calling from this debt collection agency, and the purpose of this call is to collect a debt. So if they're not like upfront and honest about who they are and why they're calling, that is also not compliant with the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. There's all sorts of ways that a debt collector can violate it, but learning about your rights and knowing what those violations are will help you better protect yourself and know like how to respond when that happens to you. If a debt collector has violated the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act when they've spoken to you, you might be eligible for compensation. Again, most debt collectors are trying to be compliant with the law, but when there's an occasional rogue debt collector, you are protected by federal law. You could file a complaint against them and potentially be eligible for compensation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that.
Okay, it's me again. Thank you so much again to Hannah and Hasan for chatting with me. Feel free to check them out at SoloSuit. They have a ton of great and affordable resources if you're facing a debt collection lawsuit. They can help you confidently answer your financial and legal questions and grant you peace of mind when facing a lawsuit. And if debt collectors are blowing up your phone, check out this video next where I'll share how you can stop them in their tracks.